It's the spring of 1820, and Pierre Navarre has just arrived at the southernmost bend of the St. Joseph River. He comes from Monroe, Michigan, where his family had been granted 500 acres of land by the Potawatomi 40 years before his birth. The United States was not yet 50 years old, and the Michigan Territory was just about the most rugged frontier in a nation reaching further west. That's where Navarre grew up, working in and around Detroit, building connections, building relationships, and building trust with the native communities who had always been there. Pierre Navarre bled French blood and frontier savvy, a combination that tended to open doors in the Old Northwest. Pierre Navarre knew how to use both. Navarre is 33 years old in 1820. He's working as an agent for John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company. He's found his spot. The southern bend of the St. Joseph River will later name a community, a town, and then a city. But none of that is here when Navarre arrives. Instead, it's just water, cold and clear and fast enough to carry a canoe without much effort. The forest crowds the banks on both sides, the shade given by ancient hardwoods that had been standing for centuries. Pierre builds a log cabin on the north bank of the river, along a well-worn trail where Native Americans travel every spring and fall, trading furs, maple sugar, baskets, and the accumulated harvest of the season. He has chosen well. The trail brings the trade to him. The trade will make him a living, maybe, if things go well, a very good one. He has not come here to build a city. He's come to make money. Alexis Coquillard will arrive a few years later to take over Navarre's operation and stake out a new trading post a little further south. Lathrop Minor Taylor will show up shortly after that and build another. And so, this place will have a few trading posts and a river with a crude network of paths connecting them, and almost nothing else. No name, no town charter, no courthouse or schoolhouse or church. Just a few European-descended settlers and their families, huddled at a river bend at the outer edge of what the United States of America has so far managed to organize into anything resembling civilization. But they've got good real estate, and you know what they say about real estate. Location, location, location. See, that bend in the river, that decisive, sharp, southernmost curve, it's not just a pretty place to build a cabin. It's something much more important than that. It's an address at one of the busiest intersections on the continent. Navarre didn't come here by accident. He came here on purpose. And why? Because for hundreds of years before the settlers arrived, a lot of other people had been coming here on purpose too. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series we're exploring the earliest years of South Bend, long before it was incorporated as a city, long before the Civil War, back in the earliest years when it was just a few pioneers scratching out a living. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generosity of our sponsors and donors. One more disclaimer. In order to make things a little easier, I am going to refer to the area as South Bend for the duration of the episode, even though we'll be discussing a history that far predates the city and predates the South Bend name. That's going to be a lot easier than continually saying the place that would later become South Bend every single time. And now, with all that out of the way, let's head out onto the St. Joseph River. Let's climb into a birch bark canoe, and let's tell the history of a river that predates Pierre Navarre Alexis Coquillard, and Lathrop Minor Taylor. We are going to have to go back for this one, way back, about 12,000 years back, to the end of the last ice age. At its peak, the Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada, the upper Midwest, and New England, a wall of glacial ice more than a mile thick, grinding slowly southward under its own incomprehensible weight. Northern Indiana was buried under all that ice. There was no St. Joseph River, there was no Kankakee River, there was no Kankakee Marsh. There was only ice and the long silence of geological time. And then, very slowly, the ice began to retreat. As the glaciers pulled back, they didn't just leave. They carved, they scraped, they gouged the bedrock and pushed the earth ahead of them like an Oliver plow. When bits of those glaciers thawed and melted, that water filled in the low places to leave behind rivers, ponds, and lakes, including Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and Lake Ontario. The same retreating ice that carved the Great Lakes also shaped the terrain of what would become northern Indiana, mostly flat, with enough wandering crags to become occasional rivers that would carve courses all their own during the coming centuries. In North America, a place that didn't nearly have a name, the continent was sorting itself into great watersheds, the enormous wet places where every river eventually spilled. The glaciers shaped geography. Geography was going to shape history. The St. Joseph River, which flows northwest toward Lake Michigan, bends sharply southward right through South Bend before curling back north. At the southernmost point of that bend, the two rivers come within a few miles of each other. The overland distance between them, at its shortest, is somewhere between 3 and 5 miles depending on the season. 3 to 5 miles, that's it. That's the overland gap between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. It's the shortest land crossing between two of the most important water systems on the continent. It is where South Bend is, and it's also why. The glaciers didn't plan any of this, of course, but they did it all the same, accidentally, over the course of thousands of years. When it was over, they left behind, at South Bend, Indiana, one of the most important intersections in North America. Eventually, someone was going to figure that out. The first people arrived in this part of the continent not long after the ice left. They came following the animals that followed the new growth that followed the retreating glaciers. For thousands of years, the people who lived here learned the land, its rivers, its rhythms, its logic. They learned where the game ran and where the wild berries grew. They learned where the rivers could carry you and where they couldn't. At some point, long before Europeans traveled the ocean, someone walked the gap between the St. Joseph and the Kankakee. Maybe they realized what they'd found, maybe they didn't, but during the coming centuries they would all know exactly what it was. The shortest connection between the two most important aquatic highway systems on the continent. The trail they cut would be walked by uncounted generations. It became a trade route, a highway, and a corridor, connecting the people of the Great Lakes to the people of the Mississippi Basin. The Miami, whose own origin story begins at the St. Joseph River, tell in their oldest tales that their ancestors emerged from the waters and grasped the riverbank to pull themselves into being. By the time the first European explorers came looking for a water route through the interior of the continent, they didn't have to find the Portage. It had already been found. It had been in active use for generations. All they needed was someone to show them where it was.
This episode is sponsored by Alexis Coquillard's Trading Post. With a full line of cloth and threads, a well-stocked hardware store including spoons, as well as groceries, liquors, and a full-service saddlery, Coquillard's Trading Post has everything you need. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
So what is it that makes a portage so important in the first place? Why should anyone care that the shortest overland distance between the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed passes through South Bend? Because in the years before cars and trains and roads, water was all the highway that the continent had. If you wanted to move goods, furs, supplies, tools, food, weapons across the continent, you put those goods in a boat and you let the river do the work for you. It was faster than overland travel, easier on the body, and you could carry far more cargo on a boat than you could on your back. The only problem is that not all the rivers connect. So, when you have to move from a river that's part of one watershed into a river that's part of another watershed, you have to get out of the water. You have to haul your boat and all your gear up the riverbank. You've got to find a way to load it up, and you've got to carry it. All of it. In that situation, you might suddenly become very interested indeed in knowing the shortest overland distance between two watersheds. You might become very interested in learning the location of South Bend. Anyway, Robert de LaSalle was. LaSalle was a French explorer with a very specific and very ambitious problem. He had become convinced, incorrectly as it turned out, that the Mississippi River flowed west into the Pacific Ocean. He was hopeful to find an aquatic route between both halves of the enormous North American continent. He wasn't the only one, and he wasn't the first one, but if he could do it, he knew he would make France rich and make himself famous. In December 1679, LaSalle set out from Fort Miami, a crude outpost he'd built near present-day St. Joseph, Michigan, with a party of about 40 men. They paddled upstream against the lazy current of the St. Joseph River, pushing south and east into the Indiana wilderness in the dead of winter. He was not guessing. He knew where he was going. The native communities along the river had been using the St. Joseph-Kankakee Portage for centuries. The trail between the two rivers was worn smooth and made concave from generations of moccasined feet and dragged canoe holes. Every major native trail in the region, the Potawatomi Trail, the Miami Trail, the Great Sauk Trail, converged at this spot like the arms of a great wide asterisk. Any traveler with eyes and the good sense to follow a trail could have found it. LaSalle had more than eyes. He had guides. He pulled his canoes out of the St. Joseph River near Pinhook Park, and his men carried their boats across the 4 or 5 miles of prairie and wetland to the headwaters of the Kankakee. From there, the current did the rest, carrying them southwest toward the Illinois River and eventually to the Mississippi. LaSalle had used the portage, but he wasn't done with this place yet. He would be back. 2 years later, in 1681, LaSalle returned to the portage. The situation in the region was growing dangerous. The Haudenosaunee, most often called the Iroquois, were aggressive, well-armed, allied with the British, and were pushing west, threatening the tribes of the Great Lakes and disrupting the fur trade that France depended on. Something had to be done. LaSalle called a council. He gathered representatives of the Great Lake tribes beneath the shade of an enormous oak tree that stood as a landmark near the Portage landing. The Potawatomi already knew LaSalle. 2 years earlier, he'd established a fur trading partnership with a Potawatomi chief, and that relationship gave him credibility with the assembled nations. The agreement they reached that day had 2 parts. The tribes pledged to resist the encroachment of the Haudenosaunee and stand together against a common threat. In exchange, LaSalle pledged French friendship and support, and the tribes granted him safe and unimpeded passage to explore the Kankakee River and the territories beyond. They called it the Council Oak, named for the tree beneath which it was signed. By some estimates, that oak was already more than 100 years old when LaSalle sat beneath it. It would survive 2 lightning strikes in the 20th century before a tornado finally knocked it down in 1990. All that remains today is a decayed stump in the Highland Cemetery. The treaty mattered. The peace held. 140 years after the treaty was signed, LaSalle was long dead, and so were the chiefs who gathered under that tree. America was founded, a Revolutionary War was won, and the French left the new nation. But the peace between the tribes who were represented beneath that tree remained, and that was important for men like Pierre Navarre and Alexis Coquillard and Lathrop Minor Taylor. The Portage was important. It was navigable, and it was more or less safe. All they needed to do now was show up and use it.
This episode is sponsored by Alexis Coquillard's Trading Post, where there's more than ever before, including port wine, sperm oil, Mackinaw trout, Detroit beer, molasses, and tallow candles. Visit the Post real soon and see what's in stock. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
By 1820, the United States was barely 40 years old, but it was running out of land, or at least it thought it was. The original 13 colonies had long since filled in. New England was settled, the Mid-Atlantic was settled, the South had its cotton and its tobacco and its shameful economics of human bondage. The nation's eyes turned west, and the West was Indiana. Ohio had been a state for nearly 20 years. In the Michigan Territory, Detroit was a functioning city with real commerce and real connections to the wider world. Fort Wayne was founded in 1794. The frontier was moving, and it was moving towards South Bend, where there was a historic portage ripe for exploitation. The portage hadn't been lost during the years after Robert de LaSalle passed through. People knew where it was, and Detroit especially was filled with French-descended Americans who still saw LaSalle as something of a discoverer and a hero. But no matter how perfect the geography, it's tough to make money if there's not a local market to sell into and no supply chain to sell from. By 1820, those things were finally in place. South Bend was still rough and unsettled pioneer country, but it was close enough to places that weren't. Goods sold in South Bend could move easily enough into larger markets and then on to the rest of the world. The fur trade was the engine that made it work. Beaver pelts especially, fashionable in Europe, scarce in the East, and extraordinarily plentiful along the rivers and marshlands of northern Indiana. The Grand Kankakee Marsh, just a few miles south of the Portage, was one of the richest trapping grounds on the continent. The St. Joseph River teemed with wildlife. Anyone who could get those pelts out of the wilderness and into the hands of buyers stood to make real money. The Portage was the key. It always had been. Goods moving northeast could reach Lake Michigan and Detroit. From there, the East Coast and Europe. South Bend sat at the center of all of it. The same spot that had served as a continental crossroads for centuries of Native American trade was used in exactly the same way within a new economy with new players and new destinations. Setting up a trading post here wasn't a stroke of genius. It was barely even a gamble. It was more like opening a Starbucks at a busy highway interchange. The traffic was already there, the demand was already there, and the only question was who was going to be first to put up a sign. South Bend was inevitable. The laws of economics made certain of that. Pierre Navarre got here first in 1820. A few years later, Alexis Coquillard arrived and set up across the river. Lathrop Minor Taylor followed after that. If none of those three had come, someone else would have. The Portage was too powerful a moneymaker for the capitalists to ignore it forever. South Bend was going to make people rich. That's why they came, and that's how the community began. The only question was everything that was going to happen next. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. In our next episode, We are going downstate to catch up on the founding of Indiana, a piece of the puzzle that's going to be crucial to the beginning of South Bend. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.